Thanks very much for turning out. I expect some people will be filtering in as we go along because people are travelling and traffic and things like that. So thanks for coming. Got a great 40 or 50 minutes or so waiting for you now, because today what we're going to do this evening is we're all going to sit here and we're going to watch YouTube videos of funny cats. How cool is that? Yeah. Although there's a few people in the audience that are looking a bit perplexed. Is that not what you'd signed up for? No? Not? Oh dear. Yeah, okay. Right. Awkward. No, actually, that's what tonight's about. We've probably all experienced, possibly on a small scale, hopefully, or certainly heard about on a larger scale, times when products go live, websites go live, loads of people have worked on them, they've all been designed to the hilt and everything like that, and suddenly nobody is using them because it's not what they want. And the phone is ringing off the hook in the conference centre, in the call centres, with people saying, why doesn't it do this anymore? Why have you got rid of that? Why can't I do this anymore? Why don't you do this? And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can actually not misjudge our audiences. I'm Jon Dixon, and I'm one of the senior interaction designers here at Bunnyfoot. And Bunnyfoot is a company who specialise in user-centred design. We sometimes call it evidence-based design, but it's user-centred design. So, so I can pitch this right, so I can judge my audience. Can I have a quick show of hands? Who is familiar with the concept of user-centred design? Yeah, so quite a few people have used, who's used user-centred design, who does it in their day-to-day lives. Brilliant, that's great. So there's some people that are. So forgive me if I'm going over old ground for you. But for the few people in here, as I know there are some people who may have come across the term but won't know what it is, I'm going to have a quick canter through user-centred design, and in particular Bunnyfoot's flavour of it, and then we'll go on and we'll talk about perhaps one aspect of it that's a little bit more interesting. So user-centred design's been around since the 80s really. There's a guy called Don Norman was really one of the progenitors of user-centred design, and it can usefully be thought of as both a philosophy and a practice. It's a philosophy in that it's, as its name suggests, seeks to put the user at the heart of every decision that's made during the design process. It makes designers analyse and foresee how users are going to be interacting with the thing that they're designing. And more than just analyse and foresee it, it makes them test the validity of those assumptions with real users in user testing in the real world. And it differs from other design philosophies really in that respect, in that what it does is it seeks to optimize the thing that's being designed to match what the users can do or need to do or want to do with the product, rather than forcing the user to change their behaviors to accommodate the product. So the user is at the heart of it. Everybody that works in user-centered design or in any way involved in it will have a diagram something like this somewhere on their hard drive. This is Bunnyfoot's. They all vary slightly with the number of phases that there might be, but somebody will have that on their hard drive if they work in UCD, in user-centered design. And as you can see, it's a kind of iterative process, hence the loop. It goes round and round and round. And the number of phases varies from company to company. Bunnyfoot have 5, but the phases are pretty much all the same. You have a research phase, which establishes the kind of context of what it is that you're designing, the ecology of what you're designing, if you like. So you learn about the technical constraints or the business case. You learn about competitors, what else is out there in the markets that's the same, what can you steal that's good, basically, and what do you not do that isn't working for other people. And preeminently, you learn about the customers. Who are the users? Who are the people who are actually going to use this product that you're designing? The results of that research get fed through into the modelling phase, where you create models of the interactions, you create models of the product. It might be prototypes, it might be very, very early interaction concepts, and it might be, and one of the thing we're going to be looking at most tonight, it's models of the customers, and we'll see why in just a minute. But the eminent thing with that is that it's all testable. When you've got those tests right and you've tweaked all those models to make sure that you've bottomed out all of the things that could possibly go wrong, all of the misjudgments of the audience, you move into an architecting phase where you start to develop those. And that's where we're looking at developing things like navigation structures for websites. We're looking at real prototypes that people can use and test. Information architectures, wireframes, and all of that sort of stuff. You test again at this point, because what you're doing is you're front-loading risk. If you can make sure, if you find something that's wrong at this point, it's as simple as just sometimes tearing up a piece of paper and drawing another sketch. There's no cost associated with it really in time or in effort. If you leave it to this point, once you've gone live and you put something out into the world and people don't like it, there's a huge risk. Very often it's so expensive and so time consuming to actually put things right at that point that it doesn't happen. But doing it here at these phases, it's much, much cheaper and you front load the risk. The design phase is basically just you give it a coat of spray paint, you brand it, you make it look lovely, and then once it's gone live, you optimize it, you monitor it to see if it's working as you expected, and where it's not, you can tweak it. So that's user-centered design. What I want to talk about tonight, though, really is the bit in the middle, which is really the most important part. There's that. We're not going to be talking about testing per se, but we're going to be talking about users, about customers, because the whole thing with user-centered design is that all of those phases come back to that bit in the middle, which are your users. Now, you can't possibly test with all of your audience. That's just not feasible. Of course you can't. Some companies have millions of customers. You can't go out to all of them. So when you're designing and when you're testing, you have to create representations of that target audience. And those of you who've worked in UCD, who've experienced UCD before, know what these will be. They're personas. There they are. You can tell by their pastel sweaters and their perfect toothy smiles that those are personas. That's Mr. and Mrs. Stock Photo and their 2.4 lovely children. And we all have, again, these on our hard drives, those of us who work in the business. So these are personas. What are personas? Okay, personas are basically fictional characters who represent specific user types. Okay, so as I say, you can't test with everybody. So what you do is you pull out the specific user types who are usually differentiated in UCD by behaviours and needs. So you'll have certain users who will have a certain set of needs and behaviours on your site, and you represent them with a persona. And a persona is this fictional character who represents that particular type. What we use is behaviour-based personas. Very often when we go into a company, the marketing person, we're talking about personas, the marketing person will put their hand up and they'll go, well, we can actually not pay for this. This is all fine. We can take that out of the proposal completely, this whole thing where we create personas, because we've already got personas. And indeed they have, and they're probably very good personas, and they'll be standing up all around the office, you know, as cardboard standees or posters on the wall. But they tend to be market segment based. They're demographic. They basically show who can we sell to. So it'll be, this person is a C1 earning £23,000 a year. They've got 2 children. They live in Essex. You know, it'll be demographic based market segments. What we're really interested in is not that so much as the behaviours, and behaviours can exist across multiple segments. What we're interested in is what people need from whatever it is that we're actually designing for them. In most cases it's a website for us, but it's very often a product or something equally sort of three-dimensional out in the world. So what we're interested in is behaviour-based personas, and I'll show you one of ours. This is a Bunnyfoot persona. And we'll trace it through. There are 2 pages to a Bunnyfoot persona. So this is the Smiths. This is a persona for a fictional holiday company called Fab Holidays. Okay? And the Smiths, we've called them the New Horizons. So the particular user type of Fab Holidays that they're representing is actually an older couple. The kids have probably grown up and flown the nest, they've left home, they've got a little bit of money to spend, they want something new, they want to do something that they've never experienced before. They've been going on holiday every year for years and years and years and years, but they're going to the same old places, they've got themselves into a rut. What they're looking for is adventure, they're looking for a new experience, and there's the quote that sums up the representation of the user type that they are. There's a little bit of a biog usually, just to give them a face. The great thing with personas is that what they do is they allow a shared common understanding of the users, of the customers, across lots and lots of different people involved in the design. Because with a big design, you'll have designers like me, you'll have legal and compliance people, you'll have business analysts, you'll have marketing people, you'll have senior stakeholders, executives, all of whom will want to feed into that design. And by creating personas, you can just send them out and they have a shared common understanding of who those customers are. So that when you get into a big meeting and they're all sitting around the table, you don't have the hippo effect. You know the hippo effect? It's the highest paid person's opinion always wins. And because basically somebody will put their hand up, usually the senior executive, the CEO, and will say, I think that what we should do is this. And somebody else, a little bit brave, says, really, well, I think what we should do is this. And what you end up is a big debate, but eventually the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, wins. With a persona, you can actually say, well, I don't care what anybody thinks. We know that Jack and Judy, our personas, need this particular thing because it's all based on the research that we did. Here's the analytics, here's the interviews that we did, here's the ethnographic study that we did where we went out and we watched them using the product. We know that this particular set of our users need this. So it's evidence-based. It's not just a matter of everybody having an opinion because, as we all know, opinions are like bottoms. Everybody has one and they all stink. So this is what personas are for. But the other thing that they do, which is really lovely, is by giving people a face and a bit of a biog, you allow emotional involvement. You get immersed in the persona. You know, you develop empathy with them. You get to really like these people when you're designing for them sometimes. And that's very important. Emotional design, we'll talk about in a minute, is becoming more and more and more important as a differentiator when we're putting products out into a very, very wild world where there are lots of other products and lots of competitors. So that bit of a biog gives us that. Down here, there's a little bit of a matrix. And what this is what differentiates this persona from all of the other personas, all of the other user types for this design. So you can see it's really just a little matrix of sliders to be the same for every persona. In this particular case, the Smiths are more cash rich than their cash poor. They're not particularly price conscious. They're looking at the moment rather than booking. You see how that's a behavior. So they're not coming to the site in this particular case to actually necessarily book their holiday. What they're doing is they're doing a bit of research on the website, and that's what they need. So, and then other people, other personas will have different points on those sliders. And something we like to do down here is these are the kind of other sites that they'll be visiting. Very often we put particular search terms in there that they might be actually using when they go through, so that can feed through into SEO design later, search engine optimization later. And we've started to put in what devices they're likely to be using when they access the particular website, because that's becoming more and more important. So that's a persona. But this for me is the most interesting page of the persona. We have a little bit more biog at the top, but these two columns here are really where we start drilling in to the motivations of these people and what they're going to be doing on the site. We've got basically things that will make them do what we want them to do, and which is, you know, a positive value to them as well as to us. And we've got things that will stop them actually using the website in an optimal way or using the product in an optimal way. So these are the motivators, these are the things that will make them do things, these are the things that will stop them doing it. And that's all drawn from the research, and it's all based on psychology. It's behavioral psychology, really, and these are carried through. Now, I'm going to concentrate on personas, so those are the personas, but I just want to very quickly run through what happens to the personas, how they develop into the design as we go through the modelling phase. So I'm going to rush through the next few slides, but afterwards, if anybody has any questions about what you're going to see, because it is going to be a bit of a flash through, by all means talk to me afterwards. Once we've got all our personas, what we use the personas for is to create scenarios. And scenarios are basically narratives, they're journeys, they're stories about how those personas use the product, in this case, the holidays website. And what we like to do is we create 2 scenarios for each journey. The first one is the current scenario. So this is what happens to them when they go to the site as it is. Sometimes you're designing things from scratch and you wouldn't have a current one because there isn't one to have. But this one, there's an existing website. And so what this is what happens to them when they actually come to the site. So it's got all the blockers in there, it's got all the dead ends, it's got all the points where they can't find what they want. And then what we do is we create an ideal scenario, a hypothetical scenario. This is where we want to be in 7 or 8 months' time when we've done all the design work. And the differences between the ideal scenario and the current scenario drive out a set of requirements. These are the things that we're going to need to build into our design in order to make this great journey out of a poor journey that they've got now. So already we're starting to drive out content, we're starting to drive out pain points, and we're starting to look at fixing things that are currently wrong with the customer experience. That then gets sent through into a mental model. So this is the next stage. And what this is basically you've got 2 swim lanes, top and bottom. The top swim lane is what the customers are thinking and feeling at each point in their journey. So when they're researching and planning, these are the sort of questions that they'll be asking themselves. These are the kind of anxieties that they'll have. These are the kind of things that they will need to know to find out. When they're making a decision, they'll have a different set of questions, and so it continues. The bottom swim lane is the content model, and what this is how the website, the new website or the new product, whatever we're doing, answers those questions. And it's not only what it needs to do to answer those questions, it's also when it needs to do it. You can see that at this particular point, the home page needs to have that, but once they're past this, once they're into the actual decision making rather than the researching and planning, they don't really need to know that anymore, so it stops and a different set of content becomes really urgent and necessary to put in. So what this is, it's starting to develop a content map of what the product needs to actually have. And we can take that literally and build it into an information architecture and start testing that. And it's really useful for actually identifying areas where new content might need to be written because it doesn't already exist, or where it needs to be edited. So that's the mental model. And finally, what we like to produce is these things called customer journeys or experience maps. And I know that's a lot to take in, and by all means talk to me about it later. Effectively, what they are is one of these concatenates all of that into one single crib sheet, if you like. Here's the stages in the person's journey running along the top. The Fab Holidays web content is immediately underneath. Then there's a kind of graphic of their journey. The round and round ones mean that it's like a free browse. There's no time constraint. They just can do whatever they want at that particular point. The wavy ones are where it's still a free journey, but there's a bit of a time constraint. There's a direction that they're going in. And the straight ones are something like a booking process, for instance, that's purely linear. But down the right-hand column, we can see this is what the customer is doing. This is what the customer is thinking, so the rational decision making that's going on. This, really important, is what they're feeling. So what's the emotional response that they've actually got at all of these different points? And at the bottom, we put in what are the opportunities? What can we do to answer all of those things? So those are really useful things, customer journeys. But the great thing about the emotional response is it's really powerful, and it's becoming more and more the thing that differentiates some products from another. This is the bottom of a pyramid, okay? And the bottom tier of the pyramid, we kind of assume that when you come to us, you've got it. You've got a product that's desirable. So you've got a thing that people might want to buy, might want to interact with, might want, okay? Now, it used to be 10, 15 years ago when Bunnyfoot was in its infancy, or 20 years ago when Bunnyfoot was in its infancy, that we did this next tier, and pretty much that's all there was, is what you see here, is that once you'd established that you've got a product that people might want to buy, you came to us for us to make it usable, so that people could use it, that things were visible, that you didn't have light grey text on a white background, that you didn't have buttons that didn't look like buttons and all of that kind of stuff. And there's a whole set of design principles that Don Norman and Jakob Nielsen and people like that sort of developed around the design principles. I'm not going to talk about those today because basically those are a given now. If your website isn't usable, although you'd be surprised how often we look at websites or other products that aren't, you know, we fix them. But what I really am interested in is actually these top two tiers that are fairly new. Don Norman, who wrote a brilliant book back in the 80s called The Design of Everyday Things, which every designer should have on their shelves, which was about the usability bit of it, making things usable. He wrote one recently which is called Emotional Design, and it's about the emotions that products can actually make us have. And these two tiers, persuading people to do things and then making them love to do things, are really what people are concentrating on more and more and more. People like BJ Fogg and Daniel Kahneman and Daniel Arietti and people like that are working hugely in this space. There's a behavioural psychologist called Patrick Jordan that I shared a platform with a few weeks ago, and he's written a brilliant book called Designing Persuasive Products, which is all about that, you know, to stand out in the market now, to stand out on the web, you really have to have something that delights people, not just something that's usable. That's not enough anymore. And the reason that emotion is so powerful is because of this thing inside our heads. We all suppose that we're conscious beings. We think, when you think of yourself, you think of, when I think of Jon Dixon, I think of me as being a conscious individual. And I like to think that when I make a decision about buying a particular jacket or eating at a particular restaurant, I'm making that decision very rationally. I'm looking at all the evidence and I'm making a decision, and I'm doing it with this part of my brain, the big grey foldy thing that you see when you see the brain, the rational part of the brain. But in actual fact, that decision was already made ages ago in brain terms. It takes about sort of, 1.5 seconds for things to happen there. It takes milliseconds for them to happen here in the hindbrain and here in the amygdala in the middle of the brain. And this is where all of our complex behaviour really is made, but it's made at a non-conscious level. When you say, oh, I've made a decision to do so-and-so, so-and-so, after thinking about it very hard, no, you honestly haven't. You've actually made a decision without thinking about it at all. What you've done by thinking about it is you've justified it to yourself. That's what you've done. You've found reasons to make that decision. But this little part of the brain here, the reptilian brain, it's basically asking 3 questions all the time. And that's, can I eat it? Will it kill me? And can I have sex with it? And that's it's what we call the 3 Fs. It's food, it's fighting, and and it's sex. And all of this part of the brain here, so that's the early part of the brain that's asking those questions all the time. So any advert, for example, or anything that's got imagery that's to do with food, that's to do with sex, or is to do with fighting, or violence in any way, is going to go straight to that brain, and it's going to be incredibly powerful. But this bit is what deals with emotions. That's where our emotions come from. And it's this bit really that we want to be designing for, because that's what really, really gets people going and enthused. But so the problem is, as experienced designers, though, that immediately gives us a problem, because if most of the decisions and most of the powerful things that we can tap into are unconscious, how do we actually build those into our models, into our personas? Or when we're testing, how do we find out about them? Because by their very nature, they're unconscious. People don't know about it. And people are complex, fallible, weird things, okay? And so we can't just go out and ask people, what do you want from this website? Why did you make that particular decision? Because they'll tell us stuff, but actually it won't be the truth. It won't be the truth. Trust me, it won't be the truth. And the reason it isn't the truth is that people can be tricked, people forget, and people lie. Not meaningfully, I mean, not in a malicious way, but they do, and I'll prove it to you now. Okay. The visual cortex, the way that we see, right, vision is our primary sense. It's the main way that most of us perceive the world. Okay, there are other senses, obviously there are, but vision is the big one. And it's an incredibly complicated thing that happens. It's basically, as I'm looking at you now, all of the pixels, all of the photons that are bouncing around in the room, the light in the room is bouncing off you, and it's hitting 2 eyes in my case, and those 2 eyes are sending it back to that middle bit of the, actually a certain amount of processing is already being done in the retina, actually in the eyes, believe it or not. The cells at the back of your eyes process that image before it even hits the brain. Those signals then travel along my optic nerves, and they go into a little bit in the middle of the brain, which is called the lateral genicular nucleus, I think it's called. Anyway, it's a bit in the middle of the brain, in the amygdala, interesting enough, where the emotions are. And that's where a lot more processing of that signal happens. And in fact, it's divided into lots of things. At that particular point, it's divided into sort of horizontal movement and vertical movement and back and forth movement. And all of that is processed differently. In fact, believe it or not, there's a little bit in that nucleus in the middle of the brain that does nothing but process faces. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And then finally, only then does it go back into the main part, the visual cortex, where lots more processing goes on, really complicated things happen, and you end up with a perception of the world. But you can tell by the length of time that took me to actually explain, that's an enormously complicated process, and that's just one of the senses. And because it's a really complicated process, it can be easily fooled. Okay. Here's an interesting little fact. Our senses, which are the only way we perceive the world, are conveying information to our brains. This is going back to the conscious versus unconscious thing. People who deal with information theory, people who deal with how you measure information, can go down to the smallest amount of information that you can actually convey is a bit. It's basically it's a binary question. It's like a byte in computers. It's a bit of information. It's the smallest thing that will differentiate one thing from another is a bit. And they can measure how much information is coming into our brains per second. Okay? And through all the senses, every second, I got the figure wrong a little while ago when I was talking to Tim over there, and I overestimated. It's actually 100 million bits per second. So 100 million bits of information per second are actually entering our brain through our sensory apparatus every second. Okay? Who wants to take a guess at how much of that is actually consciously processed? So 100 million are coming in per second. Anybody want to take a wild stab in the dark at how much of that is consciously processed? 10 million. Okay. You were closer with the first figure before you put the million on the end of it.
43.
Very, very, very close, actually, although you slightly overestimated, Tim. In fact, opinions vary, but the figure is between 16 and 40. So it's between 16 and 40 bits of information a second are actually being processed consciously. What's happening to all the rest of it? It's not just being thrown away. It is actually all being processed, but it's being processed by those dark bits of the brain, by that unconscious. And that's where the decision making comes in. But anyway, so that's why people can be tricked. And I'm going to prove to you that people can be tricked now. Here's a very simple one. I want you all to stare at the black cross in the middle. Who's seeing a green dot? No, you're not. It's not there. There is no green dot. Your brain is making that up because of a thing called colour opponency. And it's the way that the visual cortex processes colour. We are designed by evolution to see contrasts in colour, and that's why you see a green dot. Okay, here's another one. If you look at the figure on your left, depending on whether you read vertically or whether you read horizontally, that's a completely different thing in the middle. What these two things are telling us is that context is all important. Everything is relative. Nothing is an absolute. That's not a B, because it can also be a 13. Those two greys on the other side are actually the same grey. Don't believe me? They're exactly the same grey. Oh no, they're not. Oh yes, they are. Oh no, they're not. Yes, they are. Everything's relative. So when we say that something is green, or we look at a Pantone chart and we go, oh yes, that's, magenta, like that. Actually, it's only that at this particular point in time because the light around you happens to be like that. If you took it next door, that would still be magenta, whatever the Pantone colour is, it would still be green, but it would be a completely different colour. Nothing is absolute, everything is relative, and that's why I think people can be tricked. Here's an example of something. I'm going to show you this quickly. Watch what happens. What's going on there is really interesting. Okay, there are these things called the principles of perception, which a bunch of psychologists at the turn of the last century came up with. And one of them is similarity. So when we look at things, isn't it brilliant? It's great. When we look at things, our brain assumes that things that are similar belong together. Okay, so in this particular case, because the girls have got costumes which are split into black and white vertically, even though you know what's going on, your brain can't not associate the black legs together and the white legs together. And you get this bizarre thing that goes on, is that you know what's happening, but you can't not see it. Absolutely brilliant. And there's lots of other things like that. That's just one of the things. That's just similarity. But there are lots and lots and lots of other things. Okay, so I'm saying that basically people can be tricked. You know, our senses can be tricked. The world that we experience is a construct. It's not an absolute. It's not real. Our brain is putting it together every second of our existence, and so it can be tricked. And we can see things that aren't there. We can not see things that are there, and things like that. Okay, so that's the trickery. People forget. Hermann Ebbinghaus was a psychologist working at the end of the 19th century. And through dint of much experimentation, he came up with this brilliant thing, which is the forgetting curve. So basically what this is saying is that at the point of a learning session, you will remember 100% of what is coming into you, okay? We've been going around about half an hour, so we're probably about here. So, a good 50% of what I told you half an hour ago at the beginning of this talk, you will have forgotten. You have forgotten it. You have forgotten it, never to be repeated. By the time we finish the talk in about an hour like that, it'll be down to under 40%. Seriously, people forget. It's not just the quantity, the time that we forget as well, it's the quantity. We are designed, our brains are designed to remember between 3 and 4 things at a time. Okay, there's 4 things. I'm going to give you a few seconds to look at those. Okay? Okay, can you find them? Hands up when you found them. Yep, yep, yep. Yeah, so there they are. So that wasn't very difficult, was it? Okay, so here's 6 things. Okay? Right, now find those. Hands up when everybody's got all 6. Ooh. Oh, it's a very bright crowd. Very, very bright crowd. Well, there they are, but it was a lot more difficult, wasn't it? Yeah, because actually what we did, our brains remember things in chunks of 3 and 4. And that's why on a credit card number, for instance, if you break that 16-digit number down into 4 groups of 4, it's much easier to remember because you can remember 4 numbers, and you can also remember the 4 chunks. You can remember that four digits 4 times, but when you put them all together and you have a 16-digit number, you can't remember it. And it's why, for instance, a practical thing, when you're designing forms, okay, try whenever a telephone number is thought of as being split it on the form, because people will find it a lot easier. Mobile numbers are slightly different, but I won't go into that now. So people forget. Right, and people lie. So there's a photograph, okay, have a look at it. Now, if I asked you all to be honest about which one you looked at first, would you tell me the truth? Yeah, of course you would. You will look at the honesty shines out from your faces. Yeah. Would you tell me which one you looked at first? Which one you checked out? Okay. There's the same photographs with some heat maps overlaid them. Okay. And you know what a heat map is? A heat map basically shows intensity of attention. So where it's red, lots and lots of attention has been given to that point. Where it's green, much less attention has been given to it. And where there's nothing at all, no attention has been given to it. Now, those 2 photographs there and those 2 heat maps, one of the heat maps is from 30 men, is an aggregate of 30 men. And the other heat map is an aggregate of 30 women. Which one's which? Well, you think this one is the one? Is the men. Is the men. Because it said on QI that men. Ah, cheater, QI. Damn you, Stephen Fry. Yes, I mean, you would think, wouldn't you, really, that would be the one that's from the man, because the obviously more attention is being given to the lady, and this one would be the woman, because obviously quite a lot of attention has been given to certain aspects of the man. But in actual fact, the men have all been checking out the guy, and the women have all been checking out the woman. which is really interesting, is it? And yet I guarantee you that actually if I'd have asked the question, you know, and made people answer, that most of the men would say, yeah, I was checking out the girl, yeah, damn right. And most of the women would have not, perhaps. Human beings are fallible, okay? Human beings are fallible, they are easily confused, they are complicated things, and they are really, really, really unreliable narrators of their own experience. So as designers working in the user experience field, we can't go out to customers when we're building personas or when we're testing and just go, so what was that like for you? Because they won't be able to tell us. They can't tell us. They're evolutionarily designed not to be able to tell us. So, but what we want to dig down into if we're going to build great customer experiences is the truth behind all of that. So how do we do that? Well, there is an answer. There is an answer, and we'll come to the answer. But I'm going to take a bit of a roundabout route to that answer, because although the answer is how you get to that truth is always the same, everybody in this room will have a slightly different way of actually getting to it. There are 4 things that you have to do to get to that truth, but how you get there and how you experience those are slightly different. So I'm going to now tell you my route. Okay, we're going to go on a bit of a digression and you'll think WTF in a minute, but okay. So I didn't always used to do this. I wasn't always a user experience designer. For 20 years I was a professional actor. Those are all me. Those are all me's at various times in my career. 20-year career as a professional actor. And I trained how to be an actor at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School. And back in the 70s, that's just aged me badly. But anyway, at the end of the 70s, I was at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School. And like lots of students, I lived in shared accommodation. I lived in a succession of shared flats and shared houses. And here is a bunch of my contemporaries at the time in one of those shared houses in Redland Road in Bristol. Sitting in the foreground there, that's Jenny Seagrove, who's now become a doyenne of the West End. Top right is Nick Farrell, who turns up in lots of films and television things. He was last seen in The Iron Lady, I think, playing Geoffrey Howe, I think it was, one of those guys there. On the top left is my best friend to this day, Tim Bentinck, who for 35 years has been the voice of David Archer in The Archers, and is with us tonight. Hello, Tim. And standing next to Tim with his arm around, sadly no longer with us, the lovely Pete Ackerman, is this rather quiet, intense guy called Dan. And here's another photograph from that same era. Here's Dan again in the sitting room at Redland Road with my other very dear friend, Tim's wife, Judy, who is also with us tonight, now a brilliant milliner and a great artist. And here's another picture of Dan in Redland Road doing the washing up. And you may be thinking to yourself, why the hell does he keep showing pictures of this guy Dan? Has anybody recognised him? Okay, let's look at a more recent photograph of Dan. Okay, there he is last year picking up his 3rd Best Actor Oscar. So as you can tell, our career paths have diverged considerably since the 1970s. But in an odd sort of way, you know, I think, and this may sound really surprising, that Dan and I, in our respective ways, are actually still doing exactly the same thing. Okay? Actors are always creating user experiences. But in an odd sort of way, that the actor is both the creator and the user, is also the experiencer. And they allow us to experience that experience vicariously with them through the performance. Whereas user experience designers are simply creators designing directly for an audience. But that doesn't mean that the truth and the integrity of those characters, whether they're designed to be performed, as in Dan's case, or whether they're designed to be used as representatives of my target audience, in my case, as a user experience designer, it doesn't mean that the truth and the integrity of those people can be any less. Okay? We need to find out the truth of our characters in both cases. And the only way we can do that is to inhabit them emotionally and empathetically and psychologically and in every other way. Because if we don't, the experience is going to be incomplete, it's going to be flawed, and it's not going to be optimal. So, how do great actors like Dan and other actors do it? Dan is probably the best known actor of modern times to be associated with a particular school of acting called the method. Okay, Dan is a method actor. There are lots of others, but Dan is probably the most famous exponent of it at the moment. So what I want to do is I want to quickly run through 4 people who developed and contributed to this thing called method acting, this thing called the method. And I want to see if there's any lessons that can be learned from these 4 people, all of whom brought slightly different components to method acting, which are actually applicable to us as user experience designers or commissioners of user experience. Okay, so the first one is Konstantin Stanislavski, who was the guy that started the whole thing. Stanislavski was a theatre practitioner. He was an actor and a director, and also a theatre drama theoretician working in Russia at the end of the 19th century. And the kind of acting that Stanislavski would have seen when he went to the theatre as a young man would be incredibly different from the kind of acting that we're used to now. To our eyes, it would have appeared bombastic and declaratory. It would have been overly stylized. It would have been unreal in every way. It would have appeared extraordinary to us. It was fine for the time. That's what acting was at the time. Acting was symbolic. You took stances. You had particular ways of delivering lines which conveyed emotion without any real emotion being underneath it. It was a very different thing to modern day acting. But Stanislavski noticed that among this there were other actors who were completely different. They were much more restrained, they were much more truthful, they were much more believable, they were much more real. And he wondered why that was. And over the years he developed a technique to not only analyse and explain why these actors were so different, but also to teach it. And that's what eventually developed into the method. There was a lot going on at the time of Stanislavski, and he was incredibly influenced by lots of things: naturalism, modernism, the avant-garde, and all of that kind of stuff. But one man who influenced him, probably more than any other, is slightly odd in context. He was immensely influenced by a guy called Ivan Pavlov. And Pavlov, you may recognise the name, was a physiologist working in Russia at the same time, and it's the same Pavlov that we all know about as Pavlov's dogs. You've heard about Pavlov's dogs, the famous experiment. Pavlov's area of expertise and exploration was something that he called classical conditioning. And the dog experiment that he's most famous for is basically he set up an apparatus for measuring the amount of saliva that dogs produced when food was put in front of them. And what he did was he conditioned the dogs to associate the arrival of food and the consequent salivation response with a stimulus. It's usually, in common parlance, it's the ringing of a bell. In fact, it was lots of different stimuli in the actual experiment. But he got to the point where he could condition these dogs that they would salivate to the same extent just on hearing the bell, even though food was not present. And that was classical conditioning. And it almost directly led to something called behavioural psychology, which is still with us today. And the lesson for that, from that, is that what Pavlov and Stanislavski took from Pavlov is that behaviours are not innate. Behaviours are learned. Okay? And that behaviours are learned through conditioning, and conditioning comes from interaction with our environment. So therefore, if you want to, and Stanislavski directed this specifically to these actors, if you want to create truth, if you want to find the underlying psychological realism behind a certain thing, what you do is you observe behaviours. And that will actually drive out those psychological motivations. That's what classical conditioning is. And he developed lots of different ways of doing that. So you're creating the character not from the outside in. You're not putting on a character. What you're doing is you're releasing a character from inside. You're designing, if you like, from the inside out. The other thing that came out at the same time was something called psychophysiology. And psychophysiology is the observation that, and it sounds like a no-brainer to us now, that psychological states drive physical responses. To put a very simple one, when we are sad, we cry. Okay? And that was quite new at the time, the idea that psychological states produce these physical things. It had been observed, but nobody had actually kind of studied it and worked out why. And the question that Stanislavski asked, he said, well, if that's the case, can it not work the other way around? So in other words, if I as an actor want to depict truthfully a psychological state, can I do it by replicating the physical change that's associated with that psychological state? And the answer, believe it or not, is yes, you absolutely can. You can make yourself sad by crying. You can make yourself happy by smiling. And that's what actors do now all the time. That's part of the method, is you create, you bring up experienced emotional states from your past to actually inform a present performance. So the things that Stanislavski brings to it is, for the first time, there was a psychological underpinning to acting, that acting was more than just mimicking, it had a psychology. And the lesson for us as UX designers from that is that if we want to actually get to our truth, one of the planks that we have to do it with is we have to observe people's behaviours. It's not, we can't ask them things because of all the reasons that I gave. They're fallible, they're unreliable narrators, they won't tell us the truth. But if we observe their behaviours as they're interacting with the thing it is that we're designing, we can use those behaviours to drive out the psychological drivers underneath them, their needs and their wants and their anxieties and their conditioning, if you like. Okay, so we roll forward 30 years now. We're at the beginning of the 20th century, in the 1930s or so. And this guy, Lee Strasberg, started up something called the Actors Center in New York. And pretty much every film actor of note of the 20th century will have gone through the Actors Studio at some point, or will have been influenced by what was going on there. Al Pacino and Robert De Niro and Rod Steiger and all those people, Meryl Streep and Marilyn Monroe, much better actress than she's ever given credit for. They all went through the Actors Studio. What Lee Strasberg brought to the party was the observation that actors are effectively being asked to react to imaginary stimuli. That's what they do. They're being asked to react to imaginary stimuli. And he noticed, and those of us who have acted in the past, I think will be aware of this. If you ask an actor to do something, just perform an action in real life, they'll just do it. I'll go here and I'll pick up a glass of water and take a drink, and it's easy. But if I was asked to do that, if an actor's asked to do that as part of a performance on stage or in film, suddenly this kind of barrier goes up, and you're kind of, I'm exaggerating obviously, but you're faking the whole thing of taking a glass of water, and you can see bad actors do it all the time actually. It's really, really, really hard. It's one of the hardest things as an actor to be real, to just do nothing, to be a normal human being. And the reason is that we are completely unsuited by our development as human beings to play act imitating life. We can't do it. Lee Strasberg said that basically the actor has to believe. He has to make him or herself believe. You have to somehow find the reality of what it is you're doing, and then you can take that drink of water or you can do whatever it is and it becomes utterly real. And the way he did that was this thing called affective memory or emotional recall, which took Stanislavski's idea of replicating a physical activity in order to create a psychological state to its ultimate extreme. And people who follow Strasberg's method, by now it was being called, would actually dredge up emotional recall to the point where it would just completely take them over. And that's where this common misconception about method being becoming the person and staying as the person for weeks and weeks and weeks comes from. But it's to do with this emotional recall, and it can give massive psychological realism. The other thing that he brought, which is really interesting, is this bit at the bottom as well. Is for the first time he actually said, the actor can't just delve into the character's life on stage or during the course of the film. He has to actually know what's happened to that character before the film actually started, before they hit the stage. So the thing that we can take from that as UX designers, from Lee Strasberg's method, is twofold. One of which is that truth doesn't just come from objective behaviour. You can actually empathise. You can find things in yourself which are similar to what those people are being asked to do. So if you empathise with your characters, you inhabit those characters, personas or whatever, then you'll find reality and truth. But the other thing too is never forget that the user experience extends beyond that person's interaction with the little bit that we've actually designed. They come with preconceptions, they come with backstories, they come with expectations, all sorts of things. Stella Adler, fantastic American actress, and actually the only American actress or actor, in fact, to study under Stanislavski himself. She had a bit of a falling out with Lee Strasberg about this whole emotional recall and affective memory. She thought that taken to extremes it was really self-indulgent, and she didn't like it very much. Excuse me. And what she wanted was a mix of emotional memory and experience. But more than that, what she brought, which is really important to us, it's key, is she said that you cannot perform a character who is different from you without doing extensive research into that character. The phrase she used was, she said, you cannot play a blacksmith unless you know how to shoe a horse. Okay? And so what she made her actors do is actually go out and find out about everything they could about the characters that they played. And she said it's even more important when you're playing a character who is very different from you, who has a different set of life experiences, who might have different cultural attributes. What she said was, it's not enough to actually research the character's situation. What you have to research is you have to find out and embody the meaning of those situations to that particular character, because the meanings that people ascribe to situations are different from you. You will have a different set of preconceptions, a different set of attitudes, culturally, emotionally, than the person you are playing. So it's not enough just to find out how to shoe a horse. You have to find out how the blacksmith feels about shoeing a horse and where the blacksmith is in the scheme of things and all of that kind of stuff. So it was all to do with research with Stella Adler. And that's fundamental to us, really. It's not enough just to find out what the person's situation is. You have to find out what the meaning of that situation is to the person. Finally, I just want to talk very quickly about Sandy Meissner. Contemporary of Stella Adler's, and his idea that he brought to the party was that realism and truth comes from spontaneity. It comes from an instant visceral reaction. And so what he did was loads and loads and loads of improvisation with his actors. So that he said that the actor's real response, that truth comes from the actor's instant response to a real set of stimuli. So throw the script away, throw the rehearsal away. You just did exercise after exercise after exercise with Meissner, where you just reacted to stimuli that came in. And he had this thing about doing things in the moment. And that's important too, because when you're testing in particular, but also when you're designing, you have to be open to the unexpected, which is what that's telling us. But he also, the other reason I wanted to put Sandy Meissner in is this, because Sandy Meissner came up with the second best definition of acting ever, which is that it's living truthfully under imaginary circumstances, which I think is brilliant. The best definition of acting, by the way, is Ralph Richardson's. And Ralph Richardson once described acting as the art of stopping a large number of people from coughing, which I think is brilliant, and it's very true from personal experience. But Sandy Meissner's is brilliant, living truthfully under imaginary circumstances. And it's I just think that's brilliant, and it's kind of become my watchword, really, as a UX designer, living truthfully under imaginary circumstances, because the truth is that these people are exactly the same as these people, and they all have their truth. You know, truth is absolutely fundamental to an actor's performance, although there's a famous anecdote that I've heard ascribed to various people of somebody that asked a famous actor once what the secret to an actor's success was. And he said, well, the secret to an actor's success is absolute sincerity. So once you've learned how to fake that, you've got it made. But truth is important. That's what we need to get to the heart of. We need to get to the heart of truth. We need to inhabit our characters. We need, in order to design experiences for them which meet their needs, and including needs that they might not know that they have, we need to actually inhabit them. We need to inhabit them empathetically, we need to inhabit them psychologically, we need to inhabit them externally and internally. We need to design from the inside out as well as the outside in. And that's really where the actor meets the UX designer. I think in my particular case, that's my particular background. That's how I've got there. So this is the truth that we were talking about earlier. This is the answer. These points here are the answer. This is how you bypass the fallibility of human memory. This is how you bypass the capacity of human beings to trick themselves. This is how you get to that truth, and you actually avoid the unreliability of people's narrations of their own experiences. We have to use observational behaviour. Behavioural observation to actually drive out the psychological drivers and the needs and the experiences of our customers. We have to bear in mind that that experience that we're designing for is actually just the culmination of a whole life to date, that they don't just exist in that moment they're interacting with our design. They bring all sorts of prior experience to it. We have to be open to change. We have to be open to the unexpected. We have to be able to react to the unforeseen event or the unforeseen reaction in our customers. It's not enough just to find out what their situation is. We have to find out the meaning of that situation to them, because it'll be different from the meaning of that situation to us. And finally, when we're designing, we have to live truthfully under imaginary circumstances. And if we do all of that, then we'll produce great customer experiences. Because actually, when push comes to shove, the whole point is that creating brilliant, great customer experiences is actually about creating shared human experiences. And no matter what the route is that you get to that truth, to these things that you have to do to get the answer, mine was acting, yours will be very different. But that, to me, I think, is the fundamental truth about creating great customer experiences. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out.